Hi, Matt.
Hi, Reihan.
I am Reihan Salam of the New America Foundation and the Daily Beast and Forbes.com and National Review, and I'm here with my good friend Matt Yglesias.
Yes, I'm Matthew Yglesias of the Center for American Progress, and I don't know, also the Daily Beast, I guess, maybe some other places. Center for American Progress Action Fund, right? For legal purposes, in case I say the names of political parties in the course of this discussion.
What about foreign political parties like the Pirate Party?
I don't know.
We're allowed to both celebrate the Pirate Party.
The Pirate Party, yeah, no, I don't think there's any tax issues with them. They're good kids. Good kids.
So, Matt, how do you feel about the spending freeze?
Spending freeze.
Big news.
Well, you know, I'm not an enthusiast about this approach. I think that the focus on non-security discretionary spending as a cause of deficits is sort of arbitrary. I think I can accept that, you know, if there were to come a time when there were to be a big deal in place to seriously reduce the deficit, that reducing the growth in domestic discretionary spending would be part of such a deal. But I don't really know what serious budgetary purpose is advanced by having a Democratic president come out for this, and it seems a lot like a political gambit, given the context, and also just given the fact that there's, you know, as of yet, they're saying, well, it's not going to be an across-the-board freeze, it's going to be an aggregate freeze. So you have to see what the actual proposals are, how they handle the negotiations with Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, in terms of an aggregate freeze, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, the idea to me, I'm a firm believer that we need some kind of spending restraint, but it's also, given that it's an aggregate freeze, you wonder, I mean, why choose that exact level of spending as the target? Why shouldn't it be somewhat lower or somewhat higher, depending on, you know, what we perceive to be the relevant needs? I mean, that's a little bit of a kind of wonkish thing to say, but I mean, it is a little frustrating, and particularly since when you think about the departments that have been firewalled off from the non-security, domestic discretionary spending freeze. The Department of Veterans Affairs is a good example of this. It's not obvious to me that the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is obviously sacrosanct for all kinds of reasons that are congruent with both Republican and Democratic political strategies, why, you know, we can't find some efficiencies there, or, you know, when you're talking about it in the context of, it's just very frustrating because, you know, again, like if you look also at, you know, the defense sector, I mean, you know, even if you're going to say, well, broadly speaking, we should be spending 4% of GDP on defense, which, again, I don't think it should be a sacrosanct principle. But, you know, even there, I mean, you know, shouldn't that budget also be subject to some kind of consolidation, some kind of moving things around? But more to the point, one idea that a lot of conservatives have raised that you've no doubt seen by now is the idea that, you know, saying that we need a spending freeze here, even though it's about, you know, say a sixth of the federal budget, saying that actually brings into question a lot of the broader premises surrounding, for example, the federal stimulus package, et cetera. And I wonder what you make of that. I mean, the idea that we need to spend our way to the recession, the idea that, you know, given that the states function in this counterproductive.
Well, you know, I mean, you know, of course, you know, people get into trouble. I think liberals and conservatives alike with the timing of this, right? I mean, we're speaking now, and this is January of 2010, right? And so the legislative calendar dictates that in February the president has to produce a budget for the fiscal year of 2011, which doesn't actually start until, you know, several months into 2011. And the freeze that's being proposed is to say that fiscal year 2011 spending levels will stay in place in fiscal year 2012 and 2013. So we're talking about a freeze that's, you know, taking place at some distance in the future. And so I think, you know, in sort of broad strokes, what the administration is doing, a big increase in spending associated with the recession, followed by a plan to reduce those kind of outlays after the recession, is, you know, very consistent, very much in keeping with a sort of basic New Keynesian approach to the economy.
The business cycle, yeah.
I mean, you know, it's the problem, of course, is that they're locking themselves into a certain schedule. They feel that the politics of January 2010 require a gesture of fiscal consolidation, but also that the economics of 2010 require you to not do that kind of restraint. So they're proposing today restraint for the future, which could wind up looking very foolish if economic conditions aren't how they forecast. And it also, I think, opens you up to criticism that you're basically, there's something of a, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today kind of quality to it that, when the time comes, if it does come, to make the case for belt tightening, normally you're looking for a politician who's saying, no, right now, we need to tighten our belts right now. And that's not really what the administration is saying. They're saying we're going to need to do it in the future, and we want to have a political argument about it today to try to show that we've learned lessons from the Massachusetts Senate race.
And it's really a political argument with, for example, the small handful of folks to the left of them who are going to complain about this. And it's really an effort to use that, perhaps, as a way to strengthen their hand vis-a-vis these independent voters who feel that the administration has gone too far to the left. Do you think that that's kind of roughly what they've sketched out here?
It's a little hard to say because, the question, as Barack Obama and liberals have learned over the past year, and as conservatives learned, and George W. Bush learned, and every president learns, president can propose a lot of stuff, all kinds of stuff. What Congress will actually do is a completely separate question. And what the president will do when Congress doesn't do what he wants is, another question again, right? And so, announcing this proposal, I was on a conference call with a quote-unquote senior administration official yesterday evening that was arranged, and it was just with a group of liberal bloggers. And, the purpose of it seemed to an extent to be to get us to be really upset and denounce them. So that we could see, okay, Obama's breaking with the left. He's standing up to whomever. And you get those stories, and you see, if you look at the headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post today, they're very dramatic. Obama to propose 3-year freeze, blah 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 blah. At the same time, in the Hill, a much smaller newspaper that only people in D.C. read, there's an article about how House Democratic committee chairs, say they have no intention of writing appropriation bills that hit this target. And you actually saw when George W. Bush was president, the budgets he submitted to Congress regularly called for much lower levels of spending than the appropriations bills he signed at the end of the day. So to me, it's an open question in some ways that are good and in some ways that are bad as to, what is it beyond the sort of news story this week heading into the State of the Union, what is the actual policy objective here? And what is the intention to sort of fight it out?
This was a debate I remember that a lot of us had during the Bush years when you had folks like Brian Riddle of the Heritage Foundation who made the strong case that the problem with the Bush years was this lack of spending restraint. And then there were others who argued that actually when you look at this curious category of non-security domestic discretionary spending, that there was actually fairly impressive restraint, if that's what you're looking for.
Right. Although, the Bush administration also saw the reclassification of a lot of what pre-9/11 had been called non-defense discretionary spending.
Right. No, of course, there was Homeland Security
reclassified into a Homeland Security kind of catch-all.
Yeah.
And
absolutely, absolutely.
And part of the I think the arbitrariness of trying to draw this non-security line is that, legitimately, a lot of the activities that the Department of Homeland Security oversees are domestic. The Coast Guard is not a real national security institution.
Or you could also, when you're looking at various public health efforts, they conconstitute our front line of defense against,
sure.
Against the kind of foreign menace of,
or whatever. Certainly, if you think of the primary national security threat facing the United States is emanating from a relatively small number of terrorists.
Yeah.
That can still be a very serious problem worth taking very seriously. But a very small proportion of our defense budget is specifically geared toward that threat.
Well, but there's also a tendency, when you're looking at both the left and the right, to try to characterize a whole series of maladies as security threats, which is one of the things that I find more amusing. For example, ranging from avian flu to the threat, the national security threat posed by the fact that we don't have enough mathematicians and engineers who are native-born Americans, et cetera. So, I mean, I think that like there is a kind of reductio, argument here where
Right.
actually, non-security domestic discretionary spending is actually just a tiny fraction of, for example, purchasing buckets and other goods of that kind. So overall, I mean, you think that the politics of this are unpredictable, but that it is actually fairly arbitrary and not actually closely aligned with what we would think of as a real spending freeze that is going to actually impact the operations of government.
Here's a couple. I mean, one, on the politics, I think this is the kind of thing where people just tend to overrate the politics. Unemployment rate is really high. If 9 months from now the recovery is unexpectedly robust and the unemployment rate is way lower, then I think all kinds of things Barack Obama does are going to look like genius. At the same time, all the kind of pivots and gambits in the world are not going to save him or incumbent Democrats if actual conditions in the country are bleak. As for the proposal, so what they say they're going to do is go through the budget program by program, really reduce funding for programs that OMB rates as ineffective, and increase funding for programs that OMB thinks is good, and then it's going to, balance out to zero. That's fine. I mean, I think anyone would have to admit that, in fact, a lot of what the government spends money on is, just things that should not be spent money on. I mean, $1 is too much spending on implementation of sugar import quotas.
Right.
I mean, it's not that like we can't afford the salaries of the guys who do the sugar import quotas. It's pointless. It's directly harmful, in fact.
Yeah, the trouble, of course, is
at the same
that's
time,
exactly what's not likely to go anywhere ever. I mean, a lot of that, kind of most kind of, indefensible spending is exactly what. One thing I wonder sometimes is,
but so I mean,
you did see
that's the question, right? I mean, so what are you trying to do, right? Are you trying to make a point that says, okay, I'm the president, I'm not some, I don't know, cartoon liberal who thinks that all spending is great, so I'm going to write down a list of programs that are bad to demonstrate, that I have gone through it. He used to say this thing on the campaign trail about going line by line through the federal budget, which would be really boring. But so you can show something to the population and to the DC community and so on and so forth about the fact that you were aware of the existence of government waste and spending on ineffective programs. Then there's a separate question of, can you actually save any money by writing such a list down, right? Because there's just no way on earth that the Agriculture Committee is going to zero out farm subsidy spending, even though they should.
Yeah. Yeah, it does beg the question of what would happen. I mean, how would the dynamic change? How would the dynamic change if, as the country's demographic composition changes, or also as the Democratic coalition changes, even in the medium near term? For example, if you saw a lot of blue dogs, a lot of rural Democrats lose their seats in the next election, but the Democrats survive with what looks like a governing majority in the House. Would they actually, and even then, I think that you wouldn't see them, pursue some radical assault on agricultural subsidies. But over some kind of 10, 20-year cycle, you wonder if that becomes more possible, kind of as those interests fade and as the coalition becomes less attuned to, the kind of minority rural Democrats who still think that they have some potential to win in various districts.
Obviously, if the chair of the budget committee is from North Dakota, is relatively limited.
Well, and also he's someone who is, in fact, quite vulnerable. And you wonder. I mean, again, things don't, obviously don't flip, on that fast a cycle because, I mean, there's still people who consider it to be, winnable, et cetera. And also, you don't have the same kind of stable majorities that you'd like to have. That's one interesting thing about the prospect of, this whole idea, which I, still think is a little overblown, but of 2010 being a recapitulation of 1994 because, you had this incredibly long, relatively stable Democratic majority. Granted, it was a Democratic majority that was not an ideological majority, but at least a partisan majority.
But it was a real partisan majority.
Sure. Yeah, and then seeing that flip on this much faster cycle, because, again, like when you saw the Republican majorities, when you look at the number of actual votes that were involved, it was actually fairly trivial shifts in one direction or another. Even when you're looking at 2002, it was actually a very, very trivial shift in favor of Republicans. That actually could have been wiped out easily without even changing the numbers, but if you just change the distribution gently across the districts. And it is interesting to think that we might be in this era of actually, kind of relatively fast back and forth move of the Senate actually, well, the Senate, of course, puts a brake on this. But that actually, leads us, to these questions about entrenchment of power relating to, for example, the recent, free speech case before the Supreme Court, and also the filibuster and these broader questions. This is an issue that you discuss ad infinitum. But I wonder what you make of that. I mean, in this period when it's actually possible that partisan control is going to go back and forth, and given that one of the arguments that you often hear about health reform, were it to pass, that the good news is, given that we have this filibuster requirement, it becomes very difficult to repeal, et cetera. I mean, does it ever concern you that in this era of very unstable partisan majorities, that you could actually see these really sharp shifts in policy? We're of course not a parliamentary democracy, and so they're likely to get somewhat sharper shifts. But I wonder what you make of that.
Well, I mean, of course, you always have to be concerned about the fact that people you don't like, could win elections and do things you don't like. But I mean, I do think the evidence from countries with Westminster systems, from the Great Britain, Australia, Canada, etc., is that you don't in practice see all that much policy instability, at least most of the time, right? That when Margaret Thatcher ran for office, she was running at a period of time when it seemed plausible to the British electorate to say that she was going to implement really sweeping changes. And she did, although she still left a lot of the welfare state in place. But then later, Tony Blair, to make himself electable, and now David Cameron, to make himself electable, have had to promise to, not change all that much. Precisely, I mean, in part because the voters know that a British prime minister really could, do crazy dramatic stuff if he was so inclined. So you need to, demonstrate to the voters a certain level of caution and prudence. One of the odd things about the American system is that because the president is so constrained, you can make a lot of sort of conflicting implicit commitments to people, where I think most Democrats who, went to the polls for Barack Obama heard him as saying that he was going to deliver, for example, this public option on health care. Whereas at the same time, a lot of more moderate voters who voted for Obama, I think it's not that they didn't want a public option, but that they were not particularly interested in the kind of tax increases that Obama's agenda would imply. And no one could really say, as of October 2008, what would the consequences be of Obama winning, because it depended on all these other sorts of factors.
Yeah.
Which is always what happens in the United States. It's very unpredictable. And I think it would be fine to say, okay, well, we have a system that's just going to be very small c conservative if the basic trajectory that the United States is on was sustainable. But I think everyone acknowledges that it in fact isn't, and that some fairly large shifts in the policy status quo are going to be necessary over the next 10, 15 years. And I think we have a combination of institutions and political conventions that make it very hard to see how those shifts could happen.
I disagree a bit with your emphasis regarding Westminster systems. I think that, there is Paul Pearson's book about dismantling the welfare state. I mean, there are things that are structurally difficult about that, that, kind of go beyond, I think, these considerations regarding the structure of the legislature, et cetera. But another thing is that, when you're looking at other societies where you have a civil service, that, you have far fewer kind of appointed political folks who are, kind of serving in the civil administration. You have greater continuity in that regard. You have a variety of things. But I think that with regard to the continuity stuff, I think that also when you're looking at these, British prime ministers who are in power, if you look at Thatcher, I mean, from 1979 to the early 1990s, and then, you had these efforts. I mean, the way that entrenchment happens there is very different and very counterproductive. I think, for example, if you look at like rail privatization, it was actually this very explicit strategy. Let's do this in such a way that it can never be undone, despite the fact that it was done in this kind of very kind of hurried and pretty awful way. I just think that, what you're describing vis-a-vis our political system, I mean, I think that, you have this higher degree of structural polarization I think that kind of reflects all kinds of complicated factors, but I think it's kind of a fact. And I think that when you're looking at the evolution of the filibuster, this is an argument that Jay Costa's made. It's true that it is used radically more often now than it had been used before, but I think that this is actually a kind of natural accommodation and response to the fact that you have this more polarized environment. With regard to the idea that there are deep problems regarding the sustainability of spending, et cetera, I actually strongly agree with you. On the other hand, I think that the reconciliation process is pretty much designed with exactly that in mind. I mean, the idea that you can pass things that are going to actually be deficit improving over time, et cetera. I'm not a fan of the health reform model that was advanced. Not a fan of the public insurance option, et cetera. But if we really were looking at something that we collectively decided was a kind of budget crisis, it would be possible for a partisan majority to push through changes that are very hard to undo, that are deficit improving, something like a very strong public insurance option that piggybacks on Medicare rates, et cetera. Now, again, it would be somewhat difficult to do, as you'd expect.
Well,
but I think that actually, in a weird way, that's exactly the scenario that we have the institutions to deal with, namely the scenario of serious budget crisis. I mean, that's where you can really cram something down that would do the trick. It wouldn't necessarily do it in the ideal way. But I'm one of these people, and I've argued with a lot of my friends on the right about this, who thinks that actually a reconciliation-driven health bill from the Democrats would, in a lot of ways, be preferable to the alternative. In part because I think that when you're looking at the regulatory framework, and this takes us a little further afield.
Let's go afield.
When you're looking at
when you're looking to the healthcare field.
When you look at the argument, about the insurance debt spiral, why you need this to be a comprehensive bill rather than a series of incremental bills. To me, what's frustrating is that it ignores the ways in which the mandate, for example, is so incredibly weak that it won't actually function the way that we're hoping a mandate will function. It's not even as strong as the mandate that you saw in Massachusetts. And so it seems that there's a lot of kind of wishful thinking, and you have a lot of advocates who are talking about this in very elementary terms, as though you're assuming away some of the kind of administrative difficulties. Whereas an approach that something that you've advocated that I think you're absolutely right to advocate, an approach that was an incremental Medicare expansion and Medicaid expansion would be something that we know how to do. That kind of would involve all kinds of administrative headaches, but actually in brute force terms, it would be very clear to see how X amount of money contributes to solving this discrete problem.
Well, so I think we should probably explain this mandate issue a little bit more clearly. I mean, I think the basic structure of it is that the Democrats want to implement guaranteed issue and community rating regulations so that insurers will have to sell you insurance at a sort of par price, irrespective of your medical history. And so those ideas are very popular. An idea that's very unpopular is an individual mandate. Right. Is an individual mandate that says, well, everyone has to buy insurance. But what you hear from advocates of reform is that the unpopular mandate is necessary to make the other regulations technically sound, because only if you put everyone in the risk pool does it become affordable. And people get very insistent about it. It's something that the Democratic sort of wonk team has consistently refused to just embrace the cynical idea of doing the regulations without the mandate. But at the same time, the mandate that's actually written into law involves such a low fee that it's not clear that it doesn't, in practice, do the thing that the mandate is supposed to do. So if you put it into law, I mean, if the whole thing passed, and then starting 3 or 4 years from now it began to be implemented, what you would find 5 or 6 years from now is that you need to change the mandate. And make it stronger, which is the exact same problem you would have if you passed the regulations without the mandate at all.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's this kind of, there's been a slightly odd fetishization of the principle of the mandate, in a way that's been, politically harmful, and allegedly politically harmful out of a desire to write a very responsible bill, but it hasn't actually been written in a way that reaches that standard. And it's a little bit arbitrary, too, because on other elements of this, people have been willing to sort of, make things a little bit better by their lights, but say, basically, they're kicking the can down the road. And
with regard to a lot of the cost control mechanisms, I mean, that was the whole
right.
Uber argument regarding Massachusetts, that you have to do coverage expansion first on political grounds, create the political constituency, then let her rip and, kind of allow the cost growth issues to kind of grow. And then you're going to create a coalition because people are going to like having coverage. They're going to like the broad architecture. They're not going to want to roll it back to then put the more aggressive cost containment strategies in place. I think that it's, a kind of pretty plausible political idea. But I mean, I think that, Will Wilkinson has criticized this as a noble lie theory.
Will is very against noble lies, except when they are for the things he likes. So, I think that I don't. Really
but I think that it's an interesting thing. I'm actually so happy to hear you acknowledge this puzzle because I've just been reading so many blog posts by sensible journalist Karen Tumulty wrote one recently that seemed to not really acknowledge the fact that this mandate is not actually a strong mandate. And you're right, it's this kind of totemic thing. We call it a mandate. And it's so weird because, the reason why it's not a stronger mandate is that, a stronger mandate would be unconscionable to some. The idea that, you're making these young people pay this really heavy fee that amounts to,
but it's weirder. It was weakened. It was weakened at Olympia Snow's behest in order to get her vote, which she's a ban. I don't know. Obviously there's been a long and twisted legislative process here in which decisions were made to pick up the votes of individual people, and then have sort of hardened into a kind of conventional, wisdom that it all.
And then if you actually if you increase the penalties now, which I think would be, again, a sane thing to do given the architecture that we've created, then, the reaction would be, look at what they're doing. This is terrible. It's just so weird.
Right. Well, but the problem, I think, with this framework is that, in essence, the proposal, the way it's supposed to work, I think, politically, is like something that happened in Massachusetts, which is to say, liberals are gaining a lot of steam for some kind of big coverage expansion. And then some kind of moderate conservative, like Mitt Romney, is supposed to sweep in from the hills with the insurance companies at his back and come up with this as an alternative. As an alternative to some kind of big government takeover. And then people grumble, but then they shake hands, and it all comes together. As a partisan measure, it keeps, I think, breaking down around the edges, that, you do not have the business community delivering Republican votes in exchange for certain elements of it being tweaked to better fit the sort of more conservative elements in here, right? There are things that are supposed to protect the interests of certain kind of business stakeholders. There aren't really the legislative votes from those stakeholders' allies in Congress, and so at the same time, nothing is quite as strong or as airtight as it really ought to be. I think with the assumption being that were this framework put in place, what you would suddenly find is that, the morning after, Republicans don't actually want to repeal it. Instead, they want to make sure that within this framework, things conservatives want about taxes not being too high, about private companies not being driven out of business, et cetera, are taken care of. It's a sort of, pretty much everything that's gone on since inauguration, I think, has to be understood as a consequence of the fact that Republicans decided that they did not want to tinker around the margins with Obama proposals and try to make them a little bit better by their lights and then vote yes. They instead decided that they wanted to say, well, these are not our proposals, and so we're going to oppose them all, which has created a legislative process that's not normal in American history.
I think that one thing I find a little frustrating is that, this actually does, take us in the direction of the whole political speech question, because I think that when you're looking at the things that are actually motivating legislators from either political party, you have these perceptions that, it's all driven by donors, et cetera. And I think that, when you're looking at the Republicans, I mean, yes, there's this kind of classic theory that it's going to be all driven by the interest of the pharmaceutical companies and what have you. And I think that in a way that's not absurd, because when you're looking at this whole question of where do your agendas come from? I mean, when you're encountering a crisis, when you're encountering this need for some kind of, broader domestic policy agenda, or you have an opportunity to do that, there is an issue of whose agendas are on the shelf. And so in one case, it's Jacob Hacker and Campaign for America's Future has an agenda that's on the shelf. They have a broad architecture. People adopt it because it makes sense, because it actually helps them deal with certain kind of narrow one constituencies that are relevant, but it's also something that seems, relatively non-threatening. And on the R side, it tends to be folks who are tied to industry, not always, but in certain discrete areas, certainly regarding energy policy, et cetera. But I think that, when you look at the way this debate has actually played out, the argument that I've made a lot, and I think that makes sense, is that, part of the problem with the White House political strategy is that, as you suggest, they imagined that they were dealing with they had a kind of political science theory that they were dealing with some kind of center-right model legislator who wants to cut deals that are relevant to, but I think that, in fact, it actually is a matter of those legislators who are responding to pressures from their constituencies. And so when you have the Democrats move away from this position of defending every dollar of Medicare spending at all cost, there's this kind of powerful hydraulic force that is going to lead elderly voters to want you to defend every dollar of Medicare at all cost. And the Republicans, regardless of whether or not it reflects what folks at National Review, et cetera, see as the kind of core ideological principle behind movement conservatism, et cetera, et cetera, those folks are going to get represented. They're going to acquire some kind of voice. So you have people like Jane Norton. You see all of these Republican campaigns saying that of our three bedrock principles, one is that we are going to defend Medicare. It's been elevated to this. And, of course that's going to happen. And so, given the president's political vulnerability after the 2008 election with these older white voters, what's puzzling is that, you led the way that you led. And I'm definitely in the kind of Mickey Cow school of thought that, that was just really, really odd. And I believe another thing that I think you might disagree with, namely that had the president been more explicit about, we need to make a trade-off here, and this is going to be expensive, but it's worth it, because yes, you might have insurance now, but over the last 2 years, about a third of you haven't, et cetera, et cetera. Just kind of an explicit argument for, why this works. And then put in place something that I wouldn't like, but something that I think would have resonated more, and where his popularity on the health reform question would have declined, but wouldn't have declined as quickly and catastrophically as it did, because I think that the approach engendered a lot of mistrust.
I honestly think, I think this is the fact that every political operative and commentator in America, I think, needs to understand, is that if Obama made a mistake in his approach to universal health care, I think the mistake was trying to have universal health care. That it's just not, it's literally not possible to do very large domestic policy shifts if the minority party has the sort of Senate obstruction tools at their disposal and wants to mount uniform opposition to it. That, Obama started very popular initially in this process. Some people thought, the liberals tried to do a certain amount of concern trolling. Oh, aren't Republicans going to be in so much trouble being such this party of no, opposed to everything Obama's doing? And, that was, basically BS. And the Republican strategy to just keep opposing and stalling and opposing and stalling and opposing and stalling until the president looked, partisan and extreme and so on and so forth, worked fine. And then it turned out that the economy continued to do very badly, that the stimulus did not achieve the high hopes set out for it. And so now he's in a position of political weakness. But, I don't think that George W. Bush could have had a different tactical approach to Social Security privatization. I don't think Obama could have had a different tactical approach to healthcare reform. That you could change American political institutions to make it easier to do things on a partisan basis, or you could have the party leaders change their mind about, what it is they actually want to do. There's possibly, probably, maybe some subject that if Barack Obama and Mitch McConnell sat down in a room, they would both
Yeah.
want to act on it. But, if they don't, right, I mean, Mitch McConnell doesn't want a universal health care bill, and he doesn't want a climate change bill. And so you're not going to get bills of either of those kinds.
I think that's probably right, and I think that one thing that's noteworthy about this legislative scenario that we've seen unfold is that it was so brittle, and it was so dependent on the kind of overcoming the filibuster, et cetera,
Right.
And that required so many circumstances that really, I mean, everyone should have known could fade away at any given time. Being so dependent on Lieberman and Nelson. Being so dependent on Specter having switched, it's just seems
right. And the Specter thing
Yeah.
itself was odd. I mean, it happened, which has made it seem normal to everyone. But
yeah,
it was a strange turn of events. And I think in some way, if that had never happened, if Toomey had never run, and Specter had stayed as a Republican, then Specter, like Collins and Snow, would have wound up in opposition. And I think it would have just been, you just would have seen earlier that there's a mathematical problem,
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I think that's completely right. One thing that I find interesting, though, is that I think that there were pieces of big-ticket legislation that would have been hard for Republicans to oppose, that, again, wouldn't have been, this kind of universal health reform. And I think that actually, I mean, again, this is a difference between us. I think that the fact that, there's going to be this structural resistance to this kind, for example, this combination of subsidies and mandates, et cetera, I don't think that's a bad thing. But I do think that we could have done something along the lines of federalizing Medicaid, and this could reflect my naivete, but I think that there are enough Republicans who could say that, okay, well, this is this unfunded mandate, this doesn't work very well, let's do some kind of swap, and kind of we can transfer other responsibilities, something along those lines, but something where you streamline this program, and also given that you kind of have this legitimate problem where it's red states that have this kind of much narrower eligibility. But
Sure.
again, it was something that delivered kind of a lot to these constituents. I think you could have done something that is a non-universal bill that had big structural changes that would not have been cheap, but that would have, you pay for them through a kind of variety of tax changes, et cetera.
It's possible.
That could have gotten, yeah.
It's maybe. I'll just say that as someone who reads the newspaper, watches TV, et cetera. So if I listen to what Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, even people, a Jed Gregg, Paul Ryan, more, what they have to say about national politics, and what they've had to say about national politics since, for the past year and a half, right, is that they think that what we ought to do is that taxes should be lower, especially the corporate income tax, capital gains taxes, and estate taxes. But in general, all taxes should be lower. They think that spending on the military should be somewhat higher. They think that it should be harder to mount lawsuits of various kinds. And they think that there should be less regulation of insurance companies, and probably of other kinds of companies. But I mean, the things they've been talking about, right? They have not given any indication. They sometimes say in a general sense that, Obama should have done more outreach to us or something like that. But they don't give any indication to me that there is some other agenda that they are prepared to support other than an agenda that consists entirely of tax cuts and deregulatory measures. Which is okay. I mean, that's not my agenda. People are sort of entitled to their view if they want to, and particularly on the. But there's this widespread view, I guess, in Washington that America is in some sense a quote unquote a center right nation. And yet the Republicans have managed to make themselves a rather small legislative minority in that nation. And that's by having taken, I think, a very, 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 very right-wing approach to national policy, which simply makes it difficult to imagine constructive sorts of compromises with them. Now, I know lots of people who identify as conservatives and who have some things to say that I could imagine them making bargains with Barack Obama or
right, and that's not
else,
necessarily very salient. No, I get that. I think that,
but that just doesn't,
that
doesn't mean anything.
The stimulus package, you won 3 crucial Republican votes in the Senate. And I think
Right.
that the question is, and when you're looking at cap and trade, you had a handful of liberal to moderate, House Republicans who voted for the legislation, and many of whom are now coming to regret it. But I think that,
Sure.
is there a universe of possibilities in which you end up winning somewhere between 2 and a half dozen Republicans in the Senate, where you win, kind of about a dozen? I mean, where, the political scenario had been different. And again, this is all speculative and a little silly. I'll grant you that.
Sure.
But I think that, when you're talking about something like a proposal driven by Medicare buy-in for, people who are 50 plus, and, sort of making some pretty heavy Medicaid tweaks that move you in the direction of federalizing the program. I think that then, when you look at Eric Cantor and the stuff that he was saying, circa January 2009, and, we can discount that as well.
Sure.
We should. But I think that they were very fearful. They were very fearful that they'd walked into a scenario in which President Obama had robustly high popularity and that this was not going to go away. And that, in contrast, Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi were considerably less popular, and that they could do this triangulating strategy themselves in which, we share various goals with the president, and, we just disagree with what, the folks in the House and the Senate are doing. So you can imagine a scenario in which, we can imagine all kinds of scenarios, I realize, but I think a pretty plausible scenario in which you have a much larger number of Republican defectors than you did, and the general botching of the politics of this, and kind of misunderstanding, the fact that you actually want to build this actual coalition of people rather than of legislators around certain kind of core domestic priorities. I think that you could have seen a much kind of happier, less bumpy ride. On the other hand,
I just really think that's nonsense. I've just
you don't think that there's a scenario in which you would have had moderate Republicans feel more wary of voting against the president than they do now?
No, because because I think that in fact was the strategy that was being pursued, and you saw. They were very not just clever but explicit, right? That Chuck Grassley's goal was to slow down the health reform process in order to make it more politically feasible to kill it. And it was done, and it was done brilliantly. I think that they showed themselves to have a sophisticated understanding of the way the legislative process works and of the feedback between the legislative process and popular support. And I think Obama...
Wait, I'm sorry, so who showed themselves? You mean that the Republican legislators
the Republican leadership,
okay,
yeah. And that the Obama administration came in with, I think, a somewhat... a mix of a sort of naive view that, if you were popular, people would need to bend to your will.
Right. And
an almost too cynical view that if you cut a deal with the pharmaceutical lobby, that would somehow force Republicans to do what you wanted. But that, I think Mitch McConnell has shown, in particular, over the years, going way back to the old campaign finance reform fights, but before he was leader, to be a really kind of canny operator, although not necessarily a... person with much of an agenda that he's trying to advance.
Yeah, I've got to say, I still think that if you had something that was focused on expanding access to Medicare and expanding access to Medicaid, it was just kind of a very narrow bill that, was not billed as a universal bill, but it was just kind of modeling itself in the S-chip debate. I think that it would have been really, really hard for the kind of, remaining Republicans in the Northeast and you might actually win over some of the South. I think that you would completely defang the kind of intense Medicare politics that you've seen scramble this debate. And I think that, again, the issue is, can you get literally a handful of Republicans? And that would have been enough both to kind of change the political contours of it. I still think that would have worked pretty well because, while the Republican minority is cohesive, I think that just as the Republican majorities were more cohesive than the Democratic majorities, for all kinds of reasons, I think that's true. But I think that, you are going to have a couple of people who, and again, they might later feel embarrassed about it. They might sort of, but, kind of given the composition of their districts, and, the fact that Medicare is, as we've all learned, an extremely popular program, that you would have had, some people crumble.
All right.
And also,
let's
just
pivot
substantively. Yeah, no, fair enough.
Is America doomed? Are we facing an end of influence?
Oh, good grief. What a wonderful book. So Stephen S. Cohen and Brad DeLong have just published a really neat slender book called The End of Influence.
It's short, which is what you're looking for.
Very short, very svelte. And the beauty of the book is that it offers this kind of broad overview of the decline of American influence that is not an apocalyptic book about American decline per se. They're not predicting that the United States is going to become a third world country or anything like that, but what they're saying is that at the margin, the fact that we are not going to have this kind of outsized economic power associated with, being, we might still be the world's reserve currency, but that's going to mean less. We're not simply put going to have enough money sloshing around to be able to kind of powerfully influence and bend other countries to our will. And they suggest, without going in any great detail, that it will also change the strategic environment. Just as, Britain and France were no longer able to dictate outcomes, just as they were, horribly shamed and embarrassed during the Suez Crisis by the United States that did hold the purse strings. The United States is going to be far more constrained in terms of its geopolitical freedom of action. It's a generally really interesting book that also gives a very interesting portrait of how when you're looking at the rise of East Asian manufacturing powerhouses, when you're looking at the rise of resource-rich states, and how they actually dealt with their large surpluses, how they've transformed them into these very powerful funds, sovereign wealth funds, that increasingly reflect the strategic interests of these states as well. Just the way that it's going to change the shape of the global economy in ways that I think of as pretty pernicious, and I think that Matt agrees. But wow, what a tremendous overview.
Yes, right. And I mean, the point, I guess, broadly speaking, is that, America for the past several decades has played this role of importer and consumer of last resort. And if you keep doing that over and over and over and over again, you wind up out of money and into a situation where we're not going to be able to play that role in the future. And that's going to mean that while we'll still be a large and rich country, we cannot have the kind of central role in the world economy that Americans have gotten used to playing. And it's a kind of declinist book that's it's made more compelling for being so restrained.
Yeah.
But the view is not that we're going to become an impoverished and dysfunctional country, but that we're going to become a normal country.
And being a normal country can suck.
like a really big version of France, or just on a par with other.
Well, actually, it's good that you mentioned France because, and you've raised this, and I find this to be really interesting. So we could become this much bigger, sprawling version of France, except that France is kind of well suited to this world.
It's actually different
because
right.
They have this tradition of having this strong administrative state. They have privileged civil servants in a way that kind of makes them maybe marginally better at making some of these interventions and backing various national champions in a way that's not ending up being completely wasteful and politicized and what have you. And
well, right.
So,
French society, right? Because one of the arguments they make is that between the rise of sovereign wealth funds, sort of lemon socialism, that future economics are going to be more state directed, and for good or for ill, the French society is really oriented around the civil service and the state, and the idea that it's very prestigious to go work for the government, which means that even though there are certain problems associated with that approach, you really do sort of have the best and the brightest sitting around, doing your central planning for you. Whereas the United States has not traditionally put a ton of emphasis on developing state capacity in the civilian sector. That in the military sector, we have, I think, a very analogous thing where you can sort of look up some public choice textbooks and say, oh well, the Navy must be completely corrupt and dysfunctional, but actually it's not, right? The Navy's great. They have aircraft carriers, pilots. David Petraeus seems like a really smart guy. And it's because being a military officer is
has cultural prestige.
Yeah, it's a really recognized thing. So, lots of people do it. They try really hard to do it well. We take seriously the idea that problems in the military should be solved. And, so we have a nice, the mightiest empire the world has ever known. You couldn't really say the same about the Commerce Department.
Well, one thing that I'd say about the military, though,
and that's our problem.
When you look at the military, if you look, for example, at the surge strategy, and we can debate it endlessly. But I think the one thing is
Sure.
that the military is a kind of fundamentally it's a kind of outcome oriented organization that is all about like, well, we take in this information, we interpret this information, we do something with it. And I think that not all bureaucracies can be like that structurally. And when you're talking about that kind of cultural prestige, it's interesting because, vis-a-vis the military, you're kind of drawing on this segment of society where people are going to find it prestigious. They're going to want to be attracted. They're going to be attracted to it in this pretty robust way, independent of, the economic cycle, et cetera. But I think that, when you're looking at, so one thing is that, well, if you attract the best and the brightest, that will do the trick. And I kind of worry that actually something different happens. You attract the best and the brightest, and it's not so much that you become radically better at doing something, but rather that you get more resources to play with. So, for example, the financial sector has attracted the best and the brightest in the United States for a pretty long period of time. It's by no means clear that this has given us awesome finance. What it has given us is this kind of ideological superstructure around which a lot of people came to believe that we had awesome finance. And that, it's kind of, vitally important that we kind of defend the interests of, folks who are kind of within this elite, et cetera. And I think that, when you're looking at the administrative elites, or if you look at administrative guidance in Japan, sort of all these places, you certainly see all kinds of disasters that happen. But you also see this kind of broader kind of, cultural framework that kind of de-emphasizes those, that emphasizes the successes very selectively. And also, when you're looking at a lot of the state-directed economies, the United States has this fundamental dilemma, even as a normal country, which is that, when you're in the country that's pushing ahead the production possibilities frontier, it's easier for, South Korea and France, et cetera, and this is kind of a truism, and this is something that is discussed in the End of Influence, but it's easier for them to kind of deploy through kind of brute force, kind of how can we spread best practices. When Atul Gawande was writing about, agricultural extension in the New Yorker a little while ago, it was interesting because it's kind of like, we kind of had a pretty good sense, and like, George Washington Carver had a pretty good sense of what we ought to do with peanuts and stuff like that, and then you spread it through the economy. But in so many sectors, we actually have no good sense. Which slate is going to win, or which one is going to really transform education, sort of, et cetera. There's a huge amount of wasteful effort that goes into that, and I think that the United States is the country that is both the consumer of last resort, but also this is the country that had lots of venturesome consumers. Lots of people were willing to waste huge amounts of money on Betamax and Laserdisc and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and and you've talked about the consumer surplus, which is an area where we agree, where the United States, a lot of kind of our kind of advantage that doesn't look like an advantage comes from kind of the willingness to experiment with that kind of consumption, which again can be wasteful. But I think that it's a reason why, even if we wanted to, and even if we wanted to increase the cultural prestige of the administrative state and the folks who are oriented towards crafting an industrial policy, I think that it's just much trickier for the society that is the quote unquote leading society, at least along a lot of different and important dimensions.
Possibly. Well, I guess I would put that a somewhat different way. But at any rate, I think you have a path dependency over time, and different countries have different strong sectors, and what America has in contemporary United States is very strong sort of basically creative sectors, and also. But not exclusively. Probably our most state-directed segment of the economy relates to weapons manufacturing.
Oh yeah,
in which we are also a world leader. But creative sectors are extremely important to the American economy in terms of software, but also in terms of industrial design, music, entertainment of all sorts, and it's extremely difficult to imagine a really successful industrial policy in those kinds of areas. Americans,
the Canadians have produced a lot of excellent indie rock bands through their industrial policy.
Yes, they have. Well, and they're sort of America-like. But I think as an example, right? Americans invent the MP3 player. But the iPod, which is really a sort of aesthetic advance more than a technological one, is not the kind of thing that I think is really plausible to see coming out of a Ministry of Industry and Technology. And, that's just sort of our problem. Conversely, France is the world's leading builder of nuclear power
Oh yeah,
plants.
yeah. No, this is
And
incredible.
it's not at all plausible to imagine two smart guys in their parents' garage developing a company that becomes the world leader in the design of nuclear
They
power
could
plants.
do that, Matt, if only we had a better, NRC, if we had better ways of regulating nuclear power. But that's, that's my fantasy.
Maybe you say. And so, it's not a coincidence that, we have, since World War II, put a lot of emphasis on military contracting, and then also a lot of emphasis on sort of entrepreneurial production. And, we've succeeded in those areas. France has succeeded at building really fast trains and giant nuclear power plants. Japan and Germany export a lot of stuff. So countries sort of do what they do. And if there's a relative shift away from the sorts of things that we do well, you can't just say, well, so we'll do other stuff. It's inherently difficult. Just like, commodity exporting countries have problems when the things they're doing go out of style. We have a really great retail sector. Americans have come up with really smart, innovative, low-key ways to sell stuff in stores, which has been very well suited to our role as a sort of global consumer resort. But it's going to have a waning power, possibly.
I'm a lot more optimistic, I guess, about... Well, the one thing I want to mention briefly before getting to my optimism is just that I think that one of the wonderful things about this book is just as a kind of diagnosis and stylized history. In part, you see the authors talk about the shift from military spin-offs to military spin-ons and how defense industrial policy has evolved in response. And also, the thing that I really liked, and I think that you've tilted against a little bit, is the idea that, the United States actually does have very much a mixed economy that's involved as much state intervention as Western European economies. I used to think of that primarily in terms of the idea of the invisible welfare state, how much of our welfare state happens through tax subsidies, et cetera. And when you factor those in, it starts looking very much like Western Europe in terms of size of government. But they kind of have this other point that, when you look at the housing sector, et cetera, you, I think, are a little bit like, okay, well, now we're getting a little silly. I kind of think that, yeah, absolutely. This was our version of administrative guidance, and it happened to go through these sectors where our political interest was, how do we prop up, maybe it was implicitly, how do we prop up the wages of less skilled men? This kind of home ownership strategy is a good way to do that. How do we prop up the Sun Belt? Jeb Bush, passed this extremely, big government, state government property insurance for places where you should never build anything. But my optimism derives from when you're looking at this manufacturing landscape, it's true that there are big ticket items like nuclear power plants and railroads that, you need this kind of, heavy industrial base and and that's part of why I think that, well, it's okay for us to do less of that kind of thing, let other people subsidize it, et cetera. When you're looking at, the kind of defense sector, I tend to think that if we were more comfortable with doing things like letting other countries, source our frigates and what have you, which we would never do, I would be okay with that in terms of bang for the buck. But I think that, when you're looking at the advent of desktop manufacturing, fabrication machines, et cetera, I do sense that, and who knows what's going to happen to the landscape of containerized shipping, who knows what's going to happen vis-a-vis fuel prices, et cetera. I can imagine us having a lot more quote-unquote domestic manufacturing that doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of domestic manufacturing jobs. But I can see this kind of very different landscape, and a landscape in which...
in the Diamond Age.
Exactly, and a landscape in which, if our advantage is this kind of cultural advantage, and if our advantage is in kind of having these agglomerations where we attract kind of creative people who are kind of good at coming up with stuff, and, you kind of have someone else kind of make the stuff, and if, well, actually maybe, it's so cheap to make it here that we can just make it here, and it's not going to be this huge manufacturing employment boom. But I think that actually there are a lot of structural ways in which... the kind of, supply chains seem to be evolving in which, going back to fabrication, we're not sure exactly how that's going to look. And there are downsides to this too. Like, I think the big downside is that there's a real deep mystery about what happens to less skilled men in particular, and what happens to kind of a lot of people who, don't seem to have, this kind of very logical place in this kind of economy. I think that, they in fact do, and I think that you're going to see sort of new kinds of employment arise that we can't anticipate. I think that the idea of kind of fragmented fractional employment that Jonathan Zittrain
Web
really
video
feels...
punditry.
I think that, something's going to happen, but I think that, kind of right now we're trapped in the cycle of, well, we know what the next economy is going to have to be. It has to be the clean tech economy. It has to be this manufacturing clean tech economy where we all turn our homes into passive houses, et cetera. And I think that that has its place. I don't think that's a ridiculous thing, but I think the conceit that, we're going to kind of build our economy around that is a little silly because, again, there's stuff that we're not going to anticipate. And I think that there are ways in which, our kind of creative bias helps us in that regard rather than hurts us.
All right. Well, we've gone on for an hour, so I think it's time. It's time to close it off. I'll go back to my passive house.
Do you have any parting thoughts on the State of the Union or something along those lines?
I hope passive houses are mentioned.
I do too, and I hope that I hope he pronounces it correctly as well, because I think that will help connect him to the kind of German burger.
You want the correct German pronunciation?
Exactly.
Passive house.
All right, sir. It was good chatting with you.
Yes, indeed.